Danny Shaw. Danny Shaw is a professor of Latin American Studies and senior research fellow at the Council on Hemispheric Affairs. Danny, thank you for joining us. Can you hear me?
Good evening, Catriona.
Danny, what are your first impressions after Biden's speech tonight?
My first impression is what a ton of rhetoric. And for somebody who was naive or overly idealistic, it's such a triumphant speech. He certainly covered a ton of ground. You could easily fall into these half-truths, this appearance versus reality, and all of the American dreaming, all of this we, the people, when in fact Congress and the presidency is always dominated by the ruling class, by the millionaires and the billionaires. But certainly the speechwriters tonight and Biden reading those teleprompters tried to project that this corporatocracy, this autocracy in this country, this plutocracy, was an everyday people's democracy. So I think we have to go through these points and dismantle and deconstruct them.
Danny, as any new president, Biden made a lot of promises on taking office, but how much has he actually achieved in terms of those promises?
Well, for 99 days in, certainly the vaccine rollout has even exceeded what they originally promised. In terms of jobs, I think we have to go through those numbers because it's so easy to say we're producing jobs, and to give statistics that unemployment is at 10.6%, but the real unemployment rate, people who've given up on searching for work, people who have been incarcerated because they can't find work, the underemployed, those numbers grow every day. And of course, the everyday, whether it's Democrat or Republican, this U.S. supremacy, this American exceptionalism, rhetoric, this us versus them. And what Biden did was he threw any country that the U.S. cannot control economically, diplomatically, militarily, into this other category. He used the word autocracy over and over. Of course, he threw Russia, China. He didn't mention Cuba or Venezuela, but they were implied. Iran, Somalia, any country that dares to exist outside the U.S. sphere of influence continues to be attacked by the U.S. But what Biden very artfully did was put this all on the besieged, sanctioned, blockaded countries instead of actually taking any responsibility for these policies that continue to starve and punish and sanction any country that dares to stand up for themselves.
In terms of talking about China, Russia, who are the enemies of the US according to US political discourse over various years now, in terms of the trade war with China, we may have seen a slight difference with Trump. But in terms of Russia, we've seen an escalation of the discourse against Russia.
Yeah, that's correct. Biden hearkened back to so much of the rhetoric that we heard about in 2016 when Trump first came into office. A lot of myths and exaggerations about the Russians engineering and orchestrating, interfering in U.S. elections. But the double standard, because how many times has the U.S. military and U.S. intelligence and the State Department interfered in elections from Central America to Southeast Asia to the Middle East and across the world? So again, U.S. hypocrisy, not U.S. democracy, is on full display. So I think any students of the true U.S. history and U.S. foreign policy could see right through so much of this. At the same time, I don't know if we've ever heard a U.S. presidential address that did have so much progressive sounding rhetoric, even if it was only rhetoric. I mean, there was a moment where if you looked away, you could have thought it was Bernie Sanders when Biden was calling out the billionaires who profited off of the pandemic and collectively gained $1 trillion in profits. I mean, he definitely took some pages right out of the Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the most progressive Democrats' playbook.
Danny, as you're saying there, Biden called for government spending. He called for spending to support working families, which would be funded by higher taxes on the richest, while he also pledged to create new jobs and cut the costs of healthcare. All of this sounds really good, but how much can we really expect for the most vulnerable sectors in US society?
Well, the Democrats control the House and they control the Senate. So in theory, they could pass these things despite Republican resistance. Right now, Tim Scott, Republican from South Carolina, is delivering the Republican rebuttal. We could see Ted Cruz and the other Republicans on Capitol Hill rolling their eyes at Biden's rhetoric. They refuse to stand up and applaud at any turn. Certainly, the headlines are predictable from Fox News and Breitbart and Newsmax. They will attack Biden as having this radical, dangerous, progressive agenda. And they're going to do everything to oppose any type of reform for the 11 million immigrants. And that number is actually much higher, but that's the official number that Biden gave, who are classified as quote unquote illegal or undocumented. Biden had this rhetoric about U.S. foreign policy towards Guatemala and Honduras and Central America, as though in the Obama years, somehow the U.S. had a policy of benevolence versus Central America. That's absolutely foolish. We saw Obama orchestrate a coup against Zelaya in Honduras and lawfare coups against the Brazilian people and the Ecuadorian people. So again, a theme that is so prominent here is appearance versus reality and seeing through this rhetoric.
Danny, you talked about immigration there, and Biden's put his vice president on the task of dealing with immigration. It's been spoken about as a crisis at the moment. What can we actually expect in terms of new policy or the same old policy in terms of the way that the US treats people that arrive at its borders attempting to enter and have a better quality of life?
A few weeks ago, we just saw Admiral Craig Failer go to Argentina to try to establish a new U.S. base in the Southern Cone and an entry point into Antarctica to grasp onto those enormous resources. So U.S. military aggression has always been one of the most significant push factors. U.S. global control, forcing people out of their homelands by devaluing their currency. Of course, the illegal, criminal, unilateral blockades against the Venezuelan people, the Nicaraguan people, the Cuban people, the Zimbabwean people, the people of Vietnam and Pyongyang, any country, again, that dares to have an inkling of self-determination. So for Biden to say that he's somehow sincere about actually getting to the root causes, which he had the audacity to actually mention, is very insincere. It's clear that this is not a migrant crisis. This is a crisis of neoliberalism. This is a crisis of imperialism. We see massive rebellions from Port-au-Prince, Haiti. We see the people in the streets of Guatemala, in the streets of Peru, potentially a big victory in Peru coming up, a rejection of the neoliberal model. And best believe, whether it's Biden, Trump, Bush, Obama, Tweedledee or Tweedledum, these U.S. politicians are going to do everything to prevent any type of left-wing, progressive, anti-imperialist candidate from taking power, whether it's in Honduras in November, in Brazil next year, or in Peru in about a month.
Danny, going beyond slightly Biden's speech today, he spoke recently of the need for police reform in the wake of the guilty verdict against Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd. Floyd's death sparked international condemnation, shed light on the ongoing police brutality and systemic racism within the United States. But new cases are coming to light almost daily. So beyond this discourse, what concrete steps has the Biden administration taken?
Yeah, and then his next breath were that the police were honorable and there was no standing ovation for George Floyd and for Gianna, who Biden invoked, this little girl who lost her father, to 9 minutes of torture and in a police execution, a police murder, a police assassination. So Biden really is not getting, again, to the root causes of this pandemic of police violence, police brutality, police humiliation on an everyday basis. The numbers have been pretty consistent. According to most studies, 3 Americans, mostly black and brown, as we know, and poor Americans are killed every day by the police. That was consistent through the Obama years. the Trump years, now the Biden years. This is systematic. It's a pandemic. So again, I think it's a lot of lip service when what is Biden actually doing to get to the core of these issues: systematic segregation, the over-policing of oppressed communities, segregation in housing, certainly the prison industrial complex, and the social apartheid that we live through in this country every day. So even though Biden can cite or at least mention rhetorically the root causes, I don't think the Democratic establishment is getting anywhere close to the root causes of the pandemic of police violence, poverty, and unemployment, and of course, U.S. imperialism, which threatens the peace of billions and billions of people the world over.
Biden ended his address to Congress there speaking about democracy, US democracy, the example of US democracy, and the need to unite, so referring to the attack on the Capitol, for example, which has shook somehow the system in the United States. But the US society is deeply divided. What can we expect going forwards? Can we expect a more united society, or can we expect much of the same and perhaps even more of this segregation, separation within US society?
Yeah, the speechwriters and Biden, again, reading the teleprompters, very artfully constructed this discourse, this speech, and they want to leave the attack on Capitol Hill from January 6th in the distant past, but the reality is that this country is deeply polarized. Biden did call out white supremacy. He did call as terrorism, as he should, thanks to a movement of millions and millions of people led by Black America, led by the most oppressed sectors of this economy, coming into the streets against wanton racist police violence, coming into the streets against anti-Asian violence, coming into the streets against xenophobia, all of these things which are systematic in this country. So Biden paid lip service to these issues, but it's only a people's movement that can truly overthrow this legacy, centuries and centuries of really an ill, racist through and through country. In the words of Malcolm X, this system cannot deliver justice to the most oppressed people in the same way that a chicken cannot lay a duck egg. This system cannot deliver on so much of what Biden rhetorically touched upon.
Danny, you touched on this at the beginning, but given this progressive discourse that Biden spouted today, can we say that it's a reflection of the fact that there is a movement within the United States for change, and that it's got to the extent that the president has to give this sort of progressive discourse in order to gain support and popularity?
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think it's only been a people's movement in the streets across this country against the police, against the xenophobia, that has forced the Democrats' discourse to the left, at least rhetorically. It's not convenient for this country to have millions and millions of people in the streets. It doesn't look good in front of America's adversaries. So I think Derek Chauvin was their fall guy to say, look, we are dealing with the white supremacy. And of course, that was a people's gain. Derek Chauvin should be in jail, if not much worse, for the rest of his life. There should be people's justice. But it wasn't a court system that put Derek Chauvin behind bars, finally a killer cop in jail. It was a people's movement from Kenosha to Minneapolis to the streets of Harlem across this country. Millions and millions of Americans led by Black America and the youth of America who fearlessly stood up, and how many more have been killed since Breonna Taylor. We saw Mario Gonzalez killed last week in California in a situation all too similar to George Floyd, and Andrew Brown. So it's ongoing, but hopefully now some type of message has been sent by the people of this country that it is unacceptable, it's intolerable what happened to George Floyd. And hopefully there'll be more body cameras, there'll be more reforms, but I don't think any of us in the progressive movement and the anti-imperialist movement have any illusions that the Democrats are actually uprooting the true root causes of police violence.
Danny Shaw, Professor of Latin American Studies and Senior Research Fellow at the Council on Hemispheric Affairs, thank you so much for joining us once again and for offering your insight into the first 100 days of President Joe Biden's term in office. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina.
And with that, we bring this transmission on Joe Biden's speech before Congress